What's on your radar, Briahna?
Well, Robbie, the New York Times' mass rape story, screams without words, suffered another blow to its credibility yesterday, this time dealt by the New York Times' own reporting. Yesterday, the Times reported that video taken by an Israeli soldier directly contradicts evidence cited in the Times report, specifically in the original story from last December. An unnamed paramedic alleged that he found the bodies of two partially clothed teenage girls in Kibbutz Be'eri that showed signs of sexual violence. But the video footage now shows three female victims fully clothed with no signs of sexual violence. Residents of the kibbutz say no other teenage girls were killed, admitting the possibility of a simple mistaken identification. And a member of a group from Kibbutz Be'eri that looked into the sexual assault claims told the Times, and I quote, "The story is false." The New York Times now appears to be trying to whitewash its complicity in spreading mass rape propaganda by citing other outlets, including the AP, CNN, and the Washington Post, as examples of outlets who also repeated the false account of this unnamed paramedic. But shared guilt is not absolution. Outlets including Electronic Intifada, The Gray Zone, The Intercept, and Mondoweiss debunked this source and other flimsy citations in the mass rape story weeks or even months ago. For example, back on March 4th, The Intercept reported that a spokesperson at Kibbutz Be'eri said the two girls shot were, quote, not subjected to sexual abuse. Of the paramedics' claims about the girls, the spokesperson told The Intercept back then, quote, it's not true. And get this, when The Intercept reached out to the Times for comment on that story, again in early March, Times spokesperson Danielle Rhodes-Ha told The Intercept, we stand by the story and are continuing to report on the issue of sexual violence on October 7th. Apparently now they've decided to report the truth long after it's been covered by independent journalists who bothered to do the work of vetting the original reporting's flimsy evidence. As for their original story, don't hold your breath for a retraction. They've simply added a bracketed addendum to the paramedic's testimony saying that new evidence undercuts his account. An incredible understatement and, frankly, a mockery of journalistic standards. Don't forget what the original Times story alleged. It claimed that a paramedic had found the bodies of two teenage girls in a room in Be'eri. One was lying on her side, boxer shorts ripped, bruises by her groin. The other was sprawled on the floor, face down, he said, pajama pants pulled to her knees, bottom exposed, semen smeared on her back. In contrast to all that detail, when the Times followed up with the paramedic to see if he still stood by that account, he declined to say and said he'd like to put the attacks behind him. Later, an Israeli military spokesman told the Times, quote, the medic stood by his testimony but might have misremembered the place he saw the teenage girls. I see. He misremembered a mass rape scene. Pajamas, semen smeared on a child's back. He misremembered, as one does. As the Gray Zone and Electronic Intifada have been pointing out for months now, there simply isn't any corroborated eyewitness testimony, victim testimony, video evidence, or forensic evidence of mass rapes occurring on October 7th. The Screams Without Words report may stand as a generationally egregious example of media malpractice that will be taught alongside weapons of mass destruction and Iraqis leaving incubator babies to die as false justifications for brutal war. While UN Special Representative Pramila Paten's report last month was sold by the press as clear and convincing evidence that Israeli hostages were raped, what her report actually did was the opposite. First, she was clear that she had no investigative mandate, despite the UN's willingness, eagerness even, to conduct a full investigation. She did not interview any victims, despite, quote, concerted efforts to encourage them to come forward. And despite reviewing over 5,000 photos and over 50 hours of footage from October 7th, she found no evidence of rape in any of that digital evidence. Her conclusory claim that there are reasonable grounds to believe that conflict-related sexual violence occurred during the October 7th attacks was based on what the report itself describes as circumstantial evidence. Bodies fully or partially naked, both male and female. and what she describes as credible witnesses who, this is important, who she declined to name or otherwise identify. So note that the now discredited paramedic could very well be among them. Here's what we do know. Patton found that no allegations of sexual violence in Kibbutz Be'eri could be verified, and that 3 major allegations by Zaga, the right-wing religious group that provided the basis of many of the New York Times' eyewitness accounts, were unfounded. Moreover, we now know that the Screams Without Words story was co-written by Anat Schwartz, a woman with no reporting experience, with a background in Israeli intelligence, and co-written with her partner's nephew, a recent college grad with only a few food and cooking-related articles to his name. Schwartz also had the distinction of liking a tweet saying that Israel needed to turn the Gaza Strip into a slaughterhouse and that it should, quote, violate any norm on the way to victory, since those in front of us are human animals who do not hesitate to violate minimal rules. This is who the New York Times put in charge of a front-page investigation into very serious allegations of mass rape. The New York Times is facing a generational credibility crisis. Meanwhile, the liberal media class is melting down over MSNBC's hiring of Ronna McDaniel as a paid contributor. Now, here's why this is still important. Just yesterday, suspended Israeli spokesman Ilan Levy lashed back at the UN's ceasefire vote by tweeting, quote, "The world must not encourage the Palestinians to look back at the gang rapes and baby burnings of October 7th and think, hey, those atrocities really pushed our national cause forward, but that's exactly what the UN Secretary General is doing. Too long don't read. Terrorism pays." But there is no credible evidence of gang rapes, and there were categorically no baby burnings. One infant, tragically, was killed on October 7th. A 9-month-old girl who was tragically shot in her mother's arms at Kibbutz Be'eri. But she was not burned. The mass rape and baby burning propaganda continues because it provides effective justification for the mass killing and starvation of millions of Palestinians that's been going on for nearly half a year now. In early March, the Gray Zone obtained leaked slides from a confidential Israel lobby presentation based on data from famed pollster Frank Lutz that showed the most effective messaging was that which painted Hamas as brutal and savage, an organization of hate that raped women, while Israel, by contrast, has been engaged in a, quote, war for humanity. When asked what bothers them, the public said what bothers them most was, quote, raped civilians. That topped brutalized, executed, or even murdered civilians. Now here, we have a likely explanation of why there's been an unflagging commitment to a mass rape narrative in particular, even when murders are easy to prove and frankly sufficient to make whatever point you might want to make about Israeli suffering on October 7th. As for that war for humanity Israel is allegedly fighting, on Friday, Israeli drone footage was released which shows 4 unarmed Palestinian civilian youths bombed to death while trying to reach their destroyed homes. 5 days after this footage has come out, and it's been viewed millions and millions of times online, but has been covered by just one cable news outlet. As it turns out, by one of the only 2 remaining Muslim hosts on cable news following Mehdi Hassan's recent departure. An internal UNRWA investigation has reported that Israel tortured UNRWA staff in order to force false confessions that they were involved in the October 7th attack. Of course, that's resulted in the cut of UNRWA funding. Staffers say they were beaten, waterboarded, and their families were even threatened. And to the extent you're genuinely interested in accountability for sexual abuse, UNRWA also alleged that Israeli officers sexually abused Palestinian prisoners, including by inserting an electrified metal stick into their rectums. And that's not all. A U.S. State Department official also accused Israel of systematically sexually abusing Palestinian women. Israel has denied these allegations, but will there be an investigation? Or will we see what we've been seeing for the last 6 months? Israel asked itself to investigate, while American comms agents assure us, hey, we've asked Israel to look into that. We haven't heard back. Yesterday, after increasingly heated questioning from reporters as to whether or not America has an obligation to cut aid to Israel as a consequence of any number of possible human rights violations, the U.S. found Israel in compliance with international law, saying, quote, we have not found them to be in violation, either when it comes to the conduct of the war or the provision of humanitarian assistance. That's what the State Department said. What do you even say at this point? UNRWA reports that Israel has denied food convoys to northern Gaza for the last 2 months. We all know 500 food and aid trucks a day were going into Gaza prior to October 7th, when Gazans were already on a strict survival-based calorie allotment. Now it averages 100. Israel has opened fire on Palestinians waiting for flour trucks now multiple times. They've bombed food distribution centers and killed UN staff multiple times. America is building a pier because its ally, Israel, literally won't let aid in. But don't believe your lying eyes, I guess. The important thing to remember, our leaders tell us, is that Israel has a right to defend itself, and that defense includes killing more than 13,000 children, attacking hospitals, digging up cemeteries, sexually assaulting women, and flattening almost all Gazan homes. No violation of international law here. I can't wait to read all about the moral war Israel is waging in the Times. So this was a bombshell, because after all of this reporting by independent outlets, all of the props and accolades in the world to them for not just doing the reporting, but suffering the slings and arrows, all the pushback from mainstream media figures that accuse them of lying about their reporting. Now the Times is forced to issue this tiny, subtle correction. It will not retract its story, as it should, but offering just this little bracketed correction saying, oh, by the way, this key eyewitness account has been undermined, invalidated by actual video evidence of the scene that he alleged to have witnessed.
Look, I think it's certainly fair to say at this point that the Times really overreached with this story and included a lot of information that has now come under serious scrutiny, if not been disproven outright. There's clearly, I think internally they know they got it wrong because they didn't do the daily episode, right, and they're furious and frustrated with the leaks coming out of it. And frankly, the New York Times has a long record of screwing up, frankly, sexual violence stories, in my opinion. I did criticism of their Title IX campus coverage for years and years and years, which always credibly supported the accusations of accusers without looking neutrally at what countervailing information might be available. So I guess I'm not surprised they did this. They did screw up. I do think, obviously it matters because it's just a massive journalism screw up, seems to be. So I'm to be clear, I'm not about to say it doesn't matter. It absolutely does matter, and they should be held accountable for it. To me, it doesn't. Maybe some people think that if by knocking out this peg of this narrative, it weakens the case for what Israel's doing. I don't really see it that way. I mean, if the story, like, imagine the story was, this big New York Times report on all of the people who were killed on October 7th being shot in the back of the head. And then it turns out they totally screwed that up. All of that reporting was wrong. The eyewitnesses were wrong. All the people were shot in the front of the head. I mean, they were still killed. It doesn't, to me, change the horror of what happened. So it's important to set the record straight because I do think they screwed up here, but it doesn't, and a journalistic outlet should be held accountable. But to me, it's that level of screw up, it doesn't mean the murder still took place. The killing still took place.
Well, that's what's been so mind-boggling about this the whole time. And as I said, if you want to make the case for the tragedy of October 7th to the innocent people involved, well, then make that case. It's tragic even without the sexual assault. But that's where I think stuff like the Frank Luntz internal report comes in. There does seem to be a decision that was made that the way to really sell this was to emphasize the sexual assault angle. It ranked the highest in terms of the audience reaction, the public's reaction of what am I most upset by, is to say not just that people were murdered or brutalized, but they were sexually assaulted. And so you might then ask yourself, well, why do you need to sell it? The murder is enough. It might not be the most maximally impactful message, but that's certainly enough to sell the idea, let's say, that Israel has the right to defend itself or that it has the right to retaliate or whatever it is. Well, I think that's where we get to this, where we are now. We're 6 months into this almost. You now have over 31,000 people killed. Estimates are that it could be considerably higher than that because the destruction, the systemic destruction of the Gazan medical infrastructure means that there are very few public institutions left to do the counting of the bodies. But you have 3/4 of that amount being women and children. You have wanton destruction to the homes, the infrastructure, all of those kinds of things. And on top of that, you have now claims that Palestinians, men and women both, have been victims of sexual assault by the Israeli military. So if there's a person who's thinking, okay, 1,200 people were killed on October 7th, eye for an eye, there has to be some kind of retribution, someone has to answer for this. Very quickly, within the first week, more Palestinians had been killed than had been killed, Israelis had been killed on October 7th. And then it's a month into it, and we're getting to 5, 10, 20,000 numbers. And we're seeing all of these other kinds of crimes that can't really be justified in what is a proportional response to what happened on October 12th.
But I mean, I think
I
it would be ridiculous. Maybe this is secretly the motivation. I don't think anyone. I think this is just would be morally wrong to say, well, they killed, 1,200 or 800 civilians, so we get to kill 800 civilians.
Well, I would agree that's morally wrong.
It's that they killed 800 civilians, and now we are going to eliminate them, so they're not able to do that again.
Right, but who's the them?
The them is Hamas.
Well,
and
unfortunately,
they're still operating, and they have not surrendered.
Unfortunately, the people who are gotten eliminated while we're being sold the story that Hamas is the target are over 10,000 kids. What did I say? 13, 15,000 kids? Yeah. That's not Hamas. And when you're seeing drone footage of 4 youths trying to pick through the rubble that was once their home, getting tracked and murdered in cold blood when they posed absolutely no threat, that's not Hamas. So I do think these narratives, including we're going after Hamas, help to provide some kind of balm for the imagery that's coming out that is very much demonstrating that the target, whatever the intent is obviously not Hamas. And this food issue, how many humanitarians have come forward and say famine is not an accident, that is a choice. Denying food to the entire 2.3 million population of Gaza is collective punishment. It is a war crime. And so how do you start to justify that? Well, for a long time at least, framing this as a war against a people who themselves were savage and brutal, who as a people committed rapes, who were constitutionally different than Israelis who were fighting a moral war, seemed, I think, to assuage people's ethics, morals, guilt, concerns about whether or not what was happening in Gaza was, in fact, a moral war. And that is why I think they push this rape narrative. It's confusing to me, too. I don't see why it's necessary. But you're still seeing, as I mentioned, Ilan Levy, the Israeli spokesperson who was suspended over lying about other things on Twitter, is still out here making the same arguments about burned babies, none of which exist. One baby tragically was killed. And it's a horrible thing to have to put words together that even feel like you're minimizing that. But that baby that was killed horribly was not burned. So why are you continuing to lie about it?
The events need no embellishment.
They need no embellishment.
I've seen the video footage.
Why would you lie?
Piled up at the music festival and elsewhere.
What kind of person makes up dead babies? That's what I think people need to be asking. And why do the New York Times, principally here, continue to print those kinds of lies?
We'll have more Rising right after this.